The Matt Walsh video has a content warning for suicide and self-harm topics. Daddy and Daddy are fighting. Matt Walsh canceling Hunter Avallone over their crazy Twitter exchange. Let's find out what happened.
Today we cancel someone named Hunter Avallone. He's apparently a YouTuber and Twitch streamer with a moderately large following, though I'd never heard of him.
Ooh, going for the I've never heard of him. He doesn't matter to me. I'm pretty sure they beefed on Twitter before, so I don't know if Matt Walsh has truly never heard of them before, but okay.
Thanks to a clip posted to Twitter by Addison Smith of OAN. And what came to my attention is that Hunter posted a lengthy video to his YouTube channel reacting to my testimony in front of the Tennessee House Committee about their now passed legislation banning child gender transitions. Hunter is apparently a big fan of child castration. He's
right off the bat, we have the castration framing trying to suggest that the second you give somebody puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, that they are going to be made permanently infertile for life, which is just not the case. Puberty blockers, as soon as you stop taking them, they are going to resume a puberty. Essentially how a puberty blocker works is it blocks the production of hormones. Hormones are responsible for the changes your body experiences during puberty. And if you stop taking the puberty blockers, you will start up your puberty right again, and you can develop sexually and you can become fertile. We even have research which shows that not even cross-sex hormones make people permanently infertile. We have the study which came out very recently from Cell Reports Medicine. Essentially what they did is this was done like at a fertility clinic, and there were trans women that tried to go to this fertility clinic that were seeking to become fertile again. These are trans women that have been transitioning medically on estrogen for years. I think that one of the women in the study was even on estrogen for more than 10 years. After stopping their hormones, they were all able to regain fertility. And I think it was a third of them were even able to conceive naturally after that. The remaining were deemed that they would be fertile with a process such as in vitro fertilization. Every single case in the study, they were able to regain fertility. Matt Walsh is just lying and trying to spin a narrative.
We'll see. He doesn't like me very much. Here's the clip that was on Twitter. It's very short. Check it out.
Adolescent children. As far as surgeries,
Wait, giving kids the puberty blockers after they've been confirmed gender dysphoric and they've consented and their therapists have consented and their doctors have consented and their parents have consented and they've been persistent in gender dysphoria for a minimum of 6 months. Yeah, that's actually a good thing, Matt.
Oh.
True. That is how the system works. You have to be diagnosed with persistent gender dysphoria for at least 6 months under the World Professional Association of Transgender Health standards to even have puberty blockers on the table, let alone any kind of like cross-sex hormone treatment. Quite a bit of screening that goes into this.
Oh, 6 whole months, you say? Well, we all know that no child would outgrow a phase after 6 months. I have never seen my own kids be interested in something or go through a phase that lasts 6 whole months.
We're not talking about something that's like a phase. We're talking about something that is a diagnosed medical condition. It's not just somebody who feels gender incongruence for 6 months that gets on puberty blockers. It's somebody that has been diagnosed with persistent gender dysphoria for 6 months that gets potential access to puberty blockers. This would be much more analogous to a child who's been going to see a therapist, a psychiatrist, for 6 months, has been presenting symptoms of ADHD, has been diagnosed with ADHD for 6 months, receiving medication for their ADHD. That seems to be just how medicine works. Track people's symptoms, track medical conditions, and if they are persistent, then yeah, medicine's an option, even for minors. With the consent of doctors and therapists and informing the minor as well, they can make informed medical decisions. We actually have studies which show that as far as the mental capacities required to perform medical consent, you would have everything that you would need along the help of doctors and therapists by about the age of 12. The other thing that we're talking about puberty blockers, or Matt Walsh seems to be concerned that why would we prescribe puberty blockers if this is just a phase? That's the whole point of puberty blockers. A person goes on puberty blockers and it turns out that their gender dysphoria was not persistent, they don't want to medically transition, they can go off of the puberty blockers and they will not be committed to any kind of permanent side effects, is what it seems to be. What's awesome about puberty blockers is that if this is a case where, you know, they've been having gender dysphoria for 6 months, but after being on puberty blockers for like a year, they seem to not be gender dysphoric anymore, and they want to undergo the puberty associated with their birth sex, they can do that. If you're concerned about this being a phase, puberty blockers are the best thing you can do, because it can help sort out who is trans and would benefit from medical treatment versus somebody who might not be trans or might not benefit from medical treatment. That's the whole point of the puberty blocker.
I mean, 6 months, this is their identity now. Might as well chemically castrate them, right?
Once again, if you go on puberty blockers, you can become fertile again. Matt Walsh is so concerned with the fertility of prepubescent children. We know how much Matt Walsh loves talking about 16-year-olds and how that's when you're technically most fertile. Classic Matt Walsh moments.
I mean, we could do exactly what we had already been doing for all of human history up until 18 seconds ago. We could just let kids go through their phases, let them grow out of it, instead of locking them in place and turning an awkward moment into a lifelong identity crisis.
Puberty blockers don't lock you in place. That's the entire point of this. You can go on the puberty blockers and you're not locked in place. You're not locked in place towards going into a puberty, and you're not locked in place towards medical transition to go through a cross-sex puberty. You're not locked into either option. That's precisely why this is so fantastic. Ultimately, there isn't a neutral decision when it comes to a kid that is presenting gender dysphoria, because either you're going to force them to go through puberty associated with their birth sex, and that can be extremely distressing and wrong for them. Or you can give them cross-sex hormones, they can go through a puberty of the opposite sex, and that can be very beneficial for them. Letting them go through their birth puberty or going through cross-sex hormones, none of those are a neutral option. Puberty blockers are the neutral option because it buys time for them to work with doctors and therapists for 2 additional years to figure out what is right for them. Puberty blockers, that's the neutral option.
But before we get too far in addressing Hunter's points, we should be fair and get the entire context. I had a little bit of a back and forth with him on Twitter yesterday where he fleshed out his argument, such as it is. He explained that children can consent to these, quote, treatments because the parents and doctors also consent. I asked, well, how does the consent of the adults somehow validate the consent of the child? In other words, if a child cannot consent to making permanent life-altering decisions, how does the consent of the adult around the child change that? And he responded that he's only talking about puberty blockers, not the cross-sex hormones or surgeries. In fact, he clarified that hormones and surgery should wait until the child turns 18, according to, in his opinion. Puberty blockers are different because they are a life-saving medical intervention, he claimed. He also noted that I am an ape and I should go F myself.
Nice. So it seems that Matt Walsh is intentionally obfuscating the concept of medical consent. The idea that somebody can provide informed consent for a medical procedure or a medical treatment, and that is an age that is younger than 18 in most contexts. It's actually typically the case that teenagers who are like 14, 15, 16, depending on the state, can do things like visit a therapist without their parents' approval even. But it also in cases where you have doctors and therapists and the parents on board, even young children that get access to medicine like ADHD meds or antidepressants in certain circumstances, because that is how medical consent works. Medical consent is a different type of consent which requires different mental capacities than something like sexual consent, for example. So that's why the age of medical consent is generally lower, and we can generally improve the process of medical consent with doctors and therapists helping out.
He answered this, quote, firstly, too much Tylenol can kill you. They aren't death pills. Puberty blockers can be detrimental if given in large doses, but beneficial when given in proper doses. Why is this so hard for your chimp brain to grasp? Medicine can be good. Too much medicine can be bad. He later insisted again, smaller doses of puberty blockers are not chemical castration. I'm fine with puberty blockers for minors. Surgery and hormones shouldn't be given until unless 18 years or older. Go back to being the creepy dude hanging outside the high school, you degenerate scum. I had to ask about 3 or 4 times for any evidence that puberty blockers are life-saving, as he claimed. And finally, after furiously Googling...
I mean, if you're interested in the evidence that puberty blockers are life-saving from the Pediatrics Journal, showing that access to puberty blockers for trans youth resulted in a 73% reduction in suicidality. That is absolutely life-saving. Here were 2 other studies which assessed access to puberty blockers and gender-affirming hormones on suicidality, finding a 40 to 70% reduction in suicidality when they were able to access this medicine in adolescence, versus a 30% reduction in suicidality when they're able to access this medicine as an adult. Being able to access the medicine that they desire when they're still in adolescence has a greater, better improvement on reducing their rates of suicidality. Happy to clarify that.
Googling for whatever random studies he could find, but certainly not read, he responded, quote, sure, I've attached some evidence below. Since you're too read yourself, firstly, here's a cohort of trans people over 40 plus years showing that no increase of suicide was present after transition. Although the suicide risk remained higher, this was due to social issues, not transition. Secondly, here's a study which found that puberty suppression and affirmation care was correlated with a 70% decrease in suicidal thoughts.
Hey, I think that's the one I just
so
cited.
again, go F yourself, you pathetic ape man.
Matt Walsh posting his L's.
First of all, you appear to be about 13 years old, but as far as I know, you're actually a full-grown man, technically, which means that you should understand by now that a weak argument doesn't become strong just by tacking an insult onto the end of it. Actually,
Wait, is Matt Walsh, of all people, really going to complain about somebody insulting his opponent? Matt Walsh, who went on a tirade calling Dylan Mulvaney ugly and lifeless to try to attack her. Matt Walsh, of all people, is going to complain about people insulting him? Really? Really? That's so crazy.
that makes your weak argument look even weak, and it makes you look like a child in the process. And this is a special problem for you since you already look like a child.
Look, if you want to call it ad hominem, you can be logically consistent and call it ad hominem, but Matt Walsh is the king of ad hominems whenever you see him talk about any trans person, and especially Dylan Mulvaney. So it's just very hypocritical for him to complain about Hunter Avallone using ad hominems when Matt Walsh says horribly dehumanizing things about trans people, and especially Dylan Mulvaney.
And if you are going to go the insult route, you probably don't want to throw terms like degenerate around. Remember, you're the one in this conversation passionately defending the right of a doctor to give a child the same drug they use to chemically castrate sex offenders.
Oh, wait. And Matt Walsh is going even further to gatekeep the word degenerate. Matt Walsh, who says that the problem is not teenage pregnancy, but unwedded teenage pregnancy, that's the problem. Matt Walsh, Mr. Pro-teenage pregnancy in wedlock, is saying that you can't throw around the word degenerate? Holy moly. Yeah, and also he said that he once again made the chemical castration point, and then said that, oh, well, did you know that puberty blockers have been used to chemically castrate sex offenders? What you can do with these puberty blockers, they're a medicine which has an effect, and that effect can serve multiple functions. The effect that puberty blockers have is they block the production of hormones. If you're somebody who is around the onset of puberty, you can take puberty blockers and it'll stop you from starting that puberty, essentially. Meanwhile, if you're a sex offender, you can be prescribed a very high dose of puberty blockers such that your body stops producing sex hormones, such that it completely kills your libido. That's why they prescribe this medicine to sex offenders. It is the same effect, but for a different purpose and for a different duration. You see, a trans kid on puberty blockers only goes in for a year or two just to pause their puberty. Meanwhile, a sex offender goes on it for presumably the rest of their life so that they don't obtain a libido, so that they don't harm others. That's a very different application of the medicine. So a trans kid that goes on puberty blockers can become fertile again. They're not permanently infertile. So dishonest to use this comparison. And then to gatekeep the word degenerate. Oh my goodness. Matt Walsh is the most degenerate person on the Daily Wire. He has an extensive history talking about the fertility of children and saying how he is pro-teenage pregnancy, including 16-year-olds getting pregnant as long as they're married. But all right, he's gonna gatekeep degeneracy.
I'm on the anti-child castration side of discussion. You're on the pro side.
See, he can't have children castrated because he thinks that they should be pregnant and married. That's the problem. But even then, puberty blockers are still not castration.
So you're free to stake out that ground if you want, but you are unfortunately precluded from ever calling anyone else a degenerate ever again in your entire life.
All right. At this point, we just need to play the clip.
So what I'm saying is that the problem is not per se teenage pregnancy, it's unwed pregnancy. That's the problem in society.
If you say something like that, you cannot throw around the word degenerate ever again. See, it's so easy to throw his argument right back at him, because Matt Walsh is the real degenerate here. He's trying to override doctors and therapists that are following research-backed guidelines that are shown to save people's lives from suicide, from depression, from anxiety, while advocating for children to become pregnant and married at 16.
Second, I'm afraid that I'm not impressed by the ability to Google a study that confirms whatever conclusion you'd already landed on and then fling it at the other side after briefly skimming the abstract.
So this is something that conservatives will do, where they'll say, oh, you just Googled a study, and anybody can Google a study which proves whatever you want it to say. But the reason why they say that is because the studies don't prove what they're trying to say, and they have to tell themselves this false narrative in order to believe they're in the right. But no, the studies are overwhelmingly clear, and I've seen Hunter Avallone's content. He's a data male. He collects his research doc. He stays up to date on the research. He's somebody that actually changed his positions on trans issues after looking into the research and after thinking about it more. Trying to characterize Hunter as somebody that Googles one study to confirm his pre-existing bias, absolutely not who Hunter is. And also, that's not what the studies show. The studies can't just say whatever you want them to say. Medical transition helps trans people, and you are coping if you believe otherwise.
Studies that confirm what I already believed. Oh, here's one. See? The problem with the study food fight.
He has to say that studies are not an argument because the studies disagree with him. What happened to facts don't care about your feelings? You know? The studies, the facts, those seem more important than Matt Walsh's feelings about trans people, right?
Two can always play at that game, and in this case, I can play it better. I have, for example, the most thorough study ever conducted on this subject, which...
Oh, Matt Walsh has a study? Let's see. Is he going to lie about the Swedish study? Or is he going to cite the rapid onset gender dysphoria bunk study? Which one do you think it's going to be? Is it going to be... Chat, throw your guesses in chat. Guess 1 for he's going to lie about the Swedish study. Guess 2 for citing the rapid onset gender dysphoria study. Let's see. Chat seems to think probably... Ooh, it's really close, really close. Chat is very undecided. Those are the 2 studies that transphobes ever cite. They either lie about the Swedish study, or they cite the rapid onset gender dysphoria bunk study.
30 years and found that suicidality is highest for trans people 10 to 15 years after medical transition.
That's the lie about the Swedish study. That's the lie about the Swedish study. Let me see if he's going to cite that source. But
you, on the other hand, have one study that focuses on people who transitioned as adults, not as children, and which, according to you, found that...
Okay, so Matt Walsh is not going to cite the study, but I know the study he's talking about. And let's show why he is lying about the study. That would be the Swedish study, 1973 to 2003. What this study did was they took the medical records of all the trans people that lived in Sweden, particularly trans people who had received bottom surgery, and they wanted to assess their mental health outcomes, whether their death outcomes, for example, whether or not they died due to various health conditions, natural causes, suicide, etc. 10 years after medical transition, trans people's risk of suicide was higher than that of the general population. So the control of the study was cis people, not pre-transition trans people. If you want to assess whether or not medical transition reduces the rates of suicidality amongst trans people, you would need to assess trans people before they medically transition and compare it to trans people after they medically transition. What this study did was they only had the data of trans people after they medically transition, and they compared it to cis people, a completely different group. Our findings suggest that sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, which it does, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism, and should inspire improve psychiatric and somatic care after sex reassignment for this patient group. This alleviates their gender dysphoria, but it doesn't fix all their problems, particularly social ostracization and marginalization along the lines of being trans. That isn't just fixed by getting bottom surgery, for example, and trans people still have worse mental health outcomes than cis people. The lie that they claim about the study is they claim that trans people are more suicidal 10 to 15 years after they transition because this study showed that they were more suicidal than cis people. We actually have data on the suicidality of trans people in Sweden, of the general trans population. 37% of the general trans population in Sweden have considered suicide, and 32% had attempted it. If we look at the suicide rate in the Swedish study of the post-transition trans people, it is significantly less than that. 7.9 per 1,000, so 0.79% is people after transition versus general trans population, 32%. That is a significant improvement. That is so much less than the general trans population. Even if we extrapolate this number over all of the years of the Swedish study, it is still far less than that 32%. That would be an overestimate of the suicidality of trans people. What this study shows is that medical transition, so you have a higher suicide risk before transition. After transition, it's much less, but it's still not as low as it is for cis people. Yes, it is good to do this medical transition. It helps improve their mental health, but it doesn't bring them completely in line with cis people because there's still that social ostracization and marginalization. Matt Walsh is indeed lying about the Swedish study. It's so funny. Whenever transphobes claim to have a study, you know it's going to be one of those two. That's all they have. lying about one study and another completely bunk study. That's all they have every time consistently.
Population. Now, you blithely declare that this higher rate of suicide was due to, quote, social issues, not
Yeah, because that's what the studies literally say. We literally have studies which assess whether or not social acceptance is correlated with trans suicide. Strong parental support decreases the likelihood of a suicide attempt within the past year from 57% to just 4%. It is overwhelmingly social ostracization and social marginalization, which is the reason why trans people unalive themselves. And also, lack of access to medical care also plays a role in this. The biggest thing is actually that social acceptance. And that's why you see that the suicide rates of trans people is still higher than the suicide rates of cis people, even after they medically transition.
because what? You somehow know why all these people killed themselves? How do you know that? Well, I mean, well, you made it up, of course. And whatever the reason for the suicides,
So you don't need to know exactly why everybody killed themselves. What you can look at is you can look at the suicide ideation of people in various circumstances, such as the people who are socially affirmed and supported versus the people who are not socially affirmed and supported.
people are raving about Genucell skin
Advertisement.
Genucell
Yo, we got anti-Hunter Avallone face cream.
in 12 usage. Genucell extract moisture. Genucell air youths.
Okay, here we go.
I'm reading now. Quote, in this prospective cohort of 104 trans and non-binary youths aged 13 to 20 years, receipt of gender-affirming care, including puberty blockers and gender-affirming hormones, was associated with 60% lower odds of moderate or severe depression and 73% lower odds of suicidality.
Hey, that study's actually in my research doc. Yeah, based study. Thank you.
Okay, well, at least this one pretends to actually prove your point rather than directly refuting it like the other one. You know anything else about this study? Like who funded it? How was it conducted? How did they find their study subjects? How did the researchers guard against things like selection bias? Did they rely entirely on self-reported data? Do you understand how infamously unreliable self-reported data is?
A lot of these factors are absolutely controlled for, both by the peer review process and by the hospitals and academic institutions that do this research. But the other thing is that there are often many studies which we conduct on people's mental health that all you can really do is rely on self-reported data. Like, for example, if you're trying to assess suicidal ideation, how can you assess suicidal ideation without using self-reported data? You're trying to understand whether or not people had ideas about suicide. Unless you have some machine that can look into their brain and figure out whether or not they're thinking about suicide, you would have to rely on self-reported data. And this is the medical standard in studies on conditions like depression, anxiety, etc. It should be no different in trans people. We can absolutely rely on self-reported data for a lot of these kind of mental health things. We have many studies on self-reported data as well as outcome-driven data, like the Swedish study, which Matt falsely claimed showed an increase in trans suicide. That was based on outcomes, and the outcomes show a significant decrease in suicide compared to the general trans population in Sweden. We have both self-reported data and outcome-driven longitudinal data, and what's really awesome about this is that the results of each are the same. Both the longitudinal data and the self-reported data both show that, yeah, gender transition reduces the suicidality of trans people. Therefore, that increases the strength of this evidence under different study conditions, with different samples, with different populations. That increases the validity of the result. What scientists do is they compile all of these results into what are known as systematic literature reviews, such as this one of 55 peer-reviewed studies, or this one of 38 peer-reviewed studies, or this one of 29 peer-reviewed studies. All of these systematic literature reviews, spanning hundreds of peer-reviewed studies, are overwhelmingly finding this exact same result. That study after study after study in different conditions, with different populations, with different samples, show that gender transition improves the mental health of trans people. By the time we're seeing hundreds of studies with different samples, with different conditions, that the strengths of certain studies are accounting for the weaknesses of others, and we get the same result every time, that gives a lot of validity to this idea, this fact, which has now been proven in study after study. Gender transition helps trans people.
A 70% decrease in suicidal thoughts. How do you quantify that to begin with?
You ask if they are experiencing suicidal thoughts, for example, in the past 12 months. You figure out the percentage that had these suicidal thoughts before they transitioned. Then you do the same thing after they transition. And you found that the difference in those percentages was 73%. I know that Matt Walsh only has a high school degree, but it's literally just, you collect the data here, you collect the data here, you find the difference in percentages. It's really that simple.
Of course, you haven't considered any of this, but it doesn't really matter because there's a fatal problem here.
He thinks that Hunter hasn't considered that. Hunter is such a data male. Hunter pours through peer-reviewed studies to help inform his opinions. If you've ever seen Hunter Avallone do debates, he comes into debates with prepared research docs, even like little synthesis pieces he's written on synthesizing what the state of peer-reviewed research is. Trying to say that Hunter is not a data male is such a lie about Hunter.
The results are based on a 12-month follow-up. Okay, they report that these kids, 12 months after beginning the transition, say that they feel better. You know what it proves? Absolutely nothing. I am not surprised that kids who have been told that transition will solve their problems would then report shortly afterwards that it has indeed solved their problem.
Okay, so Matt Walsh's claim is that, well, if the study only followed up after 12 months, what if that's different, say, decades from now? How long does Matt Walsh want? I mean, obviously there's going to be some limits to research. You know, it would be hard to have a study that's going to follow people from birth to death, for example. We actually have studies on puberty blockers, which have followed up with people as adults, referring to their use of puberty blockers as adolescents, even up to like 36 years old. So essentially, a trans person would go on puberty blockers typically around the age of 12. 36 years would be at least 24 years since the puberty blocker treatment. So they were able to do a cross-sectional analysis of the transgender survey, which had 20,619 participants, age 18 to 36 years. 16.9% reported that they wanted pubertal suppression. 2.5% received pubertal suppression. 516 people in the sample that had puberty blockers. And what they found was that after adjustment for demographic variables and level of family support for gender identity, so this is saying even lowering the outcomes of people that had supportive parents and improving the outcomes of people that didn't have supportive parents, controlling for the effect that supportive parents has on suicidality, they found that those who received puberty blockers compared to those who wanted it but did not receive it that's a 70% reduction in suicidality. And this would include people that have been off of puberty blockers for at least 24 years, 2.5 decades. 70% reduction in suicidality. Is that long enough for you, Matt? Seems the result of this much longer study coincides with the result of that shorter study. It looks like it's a consistent result, which appears again and again in different study conditions. That's very convincing to me.
The question is, how will he feel 5 years from now? 10 years, 20 years.
We literally have that. He wants 20 years. We have 20 years.
How does the adult version of the same child feel now that he has to live with the consequences of decisions that he made as a child?
70% less suicidal. That's how they feel. That's what the study showed. 20 up to 24 years later. 70% less suicidal. There you have it, Matt. He has to pretend that this data doesn't exist in order to make this argument. But the data exists and completely debunks him.
What we need are long-term follow-ups with people who transitioned as children. But as I'm constantly having to explain, there aren't any reliable studies like that because we just...
Well, hold up. If Matt Walsh's claim is that we need long-term follow-ups, then why is he advocating for a complete ban on trans healthcare for minors? If your position is we need more long-term follow-ups, what you should do is instead propose legislation which is going to make it so that when trans youth are prescribed puberty blockers, they're automatically enrolled in a long-term follow-up study that they have to follow along with as a condition for receiving these puberty blockers. If your position is truly that, we need more data so that we can do the best science possible, then you wouldn't try to ban this medicine. You would try to support legislation which requires long-term study, which requires participation in long-term study to receive that medicine. If that were the conservative position, I can agree to that. I think that that's a perfectly reasonable thing to ask, and I think that with more data, we can only do better medicine. How much people benefit from this type of treatment, and as well as identifying who would actually benefit from this kind of treatment, we would absolutely benefit from that kind of data. Matt's not interested in collecting that data. Matt doesn't want that data to exist. Matt is going to support legislation which bans all gender-affirming care for trans youth, and he has, like he did in Kentucky, or it was Tennessee, for example. That's not what Matt Walsh is advocating for. Matt is not advocating for more data to be collected. He is being disingenuous in saying we need to collect more data, because he is not supporting that.
But anyway, you never answered my question. I asked for evidence that puberty blockers are life-saving. You shouldn't need a survey to tell me that. It should be a relatively easy thing to quantify.
How would you do that if you didn't have a study to cite? That's how you would demonstrate that as a study, right? Like, what else would you do?